Good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS Independent Advisor for OTC Drugs and Labeling, Susan Crane. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with the prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign cosmetics, tobacco, food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, and medical device firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Susan Crane is an experienced professional in the pharmaceutical industry, specializing in quality and regulatory compliance for over-the-counter and dietary supplement products. She has a thorough knowledge of federal regulations pertaining to the marketing, labeling, and distribution of OTC drugs and dietary supplements, including FDA GMPs, labeling, enforcement policy, including recalls, dietary supplement, Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, Poison Prevention Packaging Act, Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, and OSHA Hazard Communication Standards. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing into the questions box. And with that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Susan.
All right, well, thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thank you to all the attendees for tuning in today. I'm sure you're all very busy, so we'll just get the ball rolling here. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides advanced. We're going to be talking about cosmetics. So how does the FDA define cosmetics? Per the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, cosmetics are those articles that are intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for, and this is an important distinction, for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. In addition, it's those articles that are intended for use as a component of any such article, except for soap. Why not soap, you might ask? It's for cleansing, right? Well, I'm not sure why, but for whatever reason, the FDA does not consider true soap a cosmetic. To be considered soap, the product must be composed mainly of the alkali salts of fatty acids. That is the material you get when you combine fats or oils with an alkali, such as lye. In addition, the cleaning action of the product must be accomplished only with those alkali salts of fatty acids. If the product contains any synthetic ingredient, it cannot be considered a soap, even though the FDA will allow you to use the term soap on the label, but those products would otherwise be regulated as cosmetics. Likewise, a true soap may only be labeled and marketed as a soap. If it claims to moisturize the skin or maybe makes you smell better, it's not considered a true soap. And finally, true soap is regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission under Title 16 of the federal regulations, not the FDA. Well, going back to that definition on the earlier slide for cosmetics, remember that both the bullet points included the words articles intended. So how does FDA actually establish intent with regard to cosmetic products? For some products, it may be clear. For cosmetics, for some products, it may not be clear. For cosmetics, the intended use is established by the claims in your product labeling and advertising. That could be whether it's online or any promotional materials like in a magazine. The consumer perception. Why does the consumer purchase your product? And what does he or she expect it to do? And also, what are the ingredients? Some ingredients may cause a product to be considered a drug rather than a cosmetic because they have a well-known therapeutic use. For example, salicylic acid in an acne medication or zinc oxide in a diaper rash product. And sometimes that intended use can be blurred. There are your typical cosmetic products like you see in this first column here, the shampoo and general makeup items. But then there are other products that have dual purposes. and those are considered the drug cosmetic products like you see in the second column. For example, using the first one here, anti-dandruff shampoo, that's obviously going to treat your dandruff, so that has a drug effect. But it's also going to wash your hair, and probably it's got a fragrance in it, so that again is a cosmetic purpose. In these cases, the FDA regulates the products as drugs, and with the exception of the ingredient declaration on your label, they would be labeled in accordance with those drug regulations that were covered in my last webinar. And I believe that's available on EAS's website if you missed it and are interested. So where do you go to find the cosmetic regulations? Well, they're in subchapter G of 21 CFR, and they include the following parts. Part 700 will be your general requirements, and that's going to be all your definitions and some specific requirements for specific products, some of which we will discuss later in the session. 701 is your cosmetic labeling, and that's going to be the main focus of today's talk. 710 and 720 are your voluntary registrations and voluntary filing of cosmetic product ingredients. Again, those are voluntary and they're not really within the scope of today's talk. But if you want to find out more about it, you can go into the regulation or you can search on FDA's website. Part 740 is your cosmetic product warning statements, and I'm going to go over those today as well. Okay, we'll skip over part, wait, I think I missed a page here. No, wait a minute. We'll skip over part 700 now, which I posted earlier on the slide, but we're going to start with the 21 CFR 701, which is your cosmetic labeling. And as I mentioned in my last webinar, I do encourage everyone to use the electronic regulations so you can be sure that you always have the most up-to-date ones. And like I said before, the nice thing about them is that you can just click on the area that you need the information for, and that's going to take you right to the relevant section. So it's all pretty easy, right? The first part of the labeling regulations describes the misbranding provisions, as they are so crucial in discussing any FDA-regulated product. In 21 CFR 701.1, there are only 2 citations. A product is considered misbranded if there are false or misleading representations with respect to another product, whether it's a cosmetic, a food, a drug, or a device. And that would include suggesting that a cosmetic product has any kind of therapeutic indication. For multi-ingredient products, if your product name includes one or more of those ingredients, but not all of the ingredients, it could also be considered misbranding. There are also misbranding provisions in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and some of these will be covered later in the presentation. These include things such as the label missing the name and address of your business, if it fails to declare the net quantity of contents, if the required information is not displayed prominently and conspicuously, or even if the container or its fill is misleading. Section 701.2 is called Form of Stating Label Requirements. And you might wonder, well, what does that actually mean? Well, this regulation has quite a bit of information. So again, I encourage you to review it on your own. And unfortunately, it's written in what I kind of call regulatory speak, so it's a little bit confusing. But basically, it's telling you to do the following in order to be considered compliant with the requirement for prominent and conspicuous placement of information on your label. The principal display panel. The required information must be on a panel that would be visible under customary conditions of purchase. That is your principal display panel. Typically, that will be the front panel, but for some products, particularly with cosmetics, it could often be the top of the container. And even if you sell online only, you're probably displaying an image of your product, so whatever that image is probably going to be what would be considered your PDP, or principal display panel. Your panel size must be large enough to provide sufficient space for the prominent display of all of the required information. Your letter style and size must be at least the required minimum size, which is defined in the regulation, and it must be in a style such that the statements can be easily read. The background contrast must be sufficient to make the required statements conspicuous and easily readable. There shouldn't be any obscuring designs or vignettes that would otherwise hide or crowd out the required statements. Notice that I've highlighted the word required in the bullets here. So what is that required information? As I said before, all products must have the PDP, or Principal Display Panel. That must include an identity statement and the net quantity of contents. The identity statement is going to be the common or usual name of the cosmetic, like lipstick or eyeshadow, or it could be a descriptive or fanciful name if the nature of the cosmetic is otherwise obvious. The statement should be in bold type, a reasonable size, and parallel to the container base. The quantity declaration should be expressed as a numerical count, fluid measure if it's a liquid, or by weight if it's solid, semi-solid, viscous, or a mixture. And note there is also a requirement that you declare your quantity declaration in metric as well as the English units, and that actually comes from the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. It's not actually part of the FDA regulations. In any case, your quantity declaration should be located in the bottom third of the PDP. However, that can be waived if the PDP area is less than 5 square inches. It should also be in bold type in a size determined by the area of the PDP and parallel to the container base, as you see in the example here. Now, there are some exemptions to the net quantity statements for certain packages, like boudoir type containers, but I will leave you to look those up if you happen to be marketing such a product and want to know what the requirements are. The other two required bits of information for the label, and that don't have to be on the PDP, obviously, are your ingredient declaration and the name and place of business. Unlike in OTC drugs, the ingredients should be declared in descending order of predominance in the formulation, and they must be prominent and conspicuous with a minimum type size of 1/16 inch height or greater. However, for small packages, you can, if you can't fit it on the label, you can affix that to a tag or a card that would accompany your product and meet the intent of the regulation that way. We'll cover ingredients in further detail on the next few slides, but let me just mention the final required item first, and that is the name and place of business of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor. And it's the same requirement as it is for drugs and pretty much every other consumer product. It's going to be the corporate name of your company and the full address, street, city, state, and zip code. However, the FDA does allow for omission of the street address if your company is listed with that street address in a city directory or telephone directory of some sort, or even an online directory. If the company marketing the product is not the manufacturer, the declaration must be qualified by wording such as manufactured for or distributed by. And there's no type size requirement for the declaration on cosmetics, other than the regulation just says it must be conspicuous. Okay, well, let's go back to those ingredient declarations, which admittedly on cosmetics can be somewhat confusing. Per regulation, they must be identified by the name established by the FDA, or in the absence of that, the name adopted for that ingredient by the compendia listed here. The compendia are listed in descending order by which they would be used for identification of an ingredient name. And if none of them list a name for the ingredient in your product, then you would use the name generally recognized by consumers or the chemical or technical name or description. For most purposes, when I've reviewed cosmetic labels, The Cosmetic Ingredient Dictionary, which is one of those mentioned on the previous slide, is a very valuable tool in ensuring that your ingredients are correctly declared. The dictionary is authored by the Personal Care Products Council, which is the trade association for the cosmetic and personal care industry. Its comprehensive list of ingredients numbers more than 13,000, and it provides ingredient names used by companies in the United States, the European Union, and other countries. There's also an INSI database, with INSI being the acronym for International Nomenclature of Cosmetic Ingredients. The URL provided here is for the Cosmetic Ingredient Dictionary. The other one for the INSI database is by subscription only. However, it's very comprehensive, so if you do market a number of cosmetics, I would advise that you get a subscription to that website. Alternatively, if you don't want to pay the money, you can come to EAS and we can help you with that, because we do actually have a subscription to that database. Besides the FDA regulations, we also need to consider the provisions of the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act here, much like we did for the Quantity of Contents Declaration. The FBLA requires that ingredients are listed by their common or usual names. Now, in many cosmetic products in Europe and elsewhere, you're going to see the botanicals listed by their Latin names, and you often see color additives identified by CI numbers. Neither of these are acceptable on their own to the FDA. However, the agency does allow use of both the Latin name or the CI number if they are included within parentheses, either within or after the common or usual name of the ingredient. And I provided some examples here, as you can see. For fragrance and flavor compounds, you would declare in descending order of predominance as fragrance or flavor, as you see in the examples here. Or alternatively, you could declare the components of the fragrance or flavor individually by their appropriate names. If an ingredient serves as both a fragrance and flavor, as you might find in a flavored lip balm or a mouthwash, it would need to be declared as flavor and fragrance, if you are going to use those terms instead of the individual ingredient names. Now, there are many other regulations that are pertinent to ingredients, and that quite honestly could be a whole separate webinar, but I'm just going to stop here and advise you to check out the many resources that are available on FDA's website if you want to know more. Like, just Google FDA Cosmetic Ingredient Regulations, and that's going to bring up all sorts of links for you. There are other labeling requirements that may or may not be applicable to your product. This is the part that I skipped over at the beginning, part 700, if you recall. And I'm only going to list them on this slide. If you should happen to be marketing any products with these ingredients, you can review them to determine if they are applicable. The only one I do want to go over is the tamper-resistant packaging requirement at 700.25. Much like OTC drug products that are intended for oral ingestion, there are some cosmetic products which present an opportunity for malicious tampering. So the FDA requires tamper-resistant packaging on these. The regulation requires that each retail package of a liquid oral hygiene product, such as a mouthwash, or a vaginal product, such as a douche, bear a prominently placed statement identifying the specific tamper-resistant feature of the package. In addition, the location of that statement must be such that it would not be affected if that feature was somehow breached or missing. Now, there is an exemption for products that are packaged in aerosol containers, as those obviously would be difficult for someone to tamper with. And you might ask, well, suppose I just sell online, it's not going to be displayed on a retail shelf, so do I have to worry about the product being tampered with? And I still would use a tamper feature unless you somehow have control of your product, because you might be storing it in a warehouse. You never know if someone in the warehouse might have a malicious intent. You never know if your product might be resold. You might sell it online, but then someone else might resell it. So I would just go ahead and use the Tamper, follow the tamper-resistant packaging as it's required here. The next few slides are going to cover the regulations regarding warning statements on cosmetics, and those can be found at Part 740 of the regulations, and you see them listed here. Starting with the general provisions, when are warning statements required? It's not like you have an OTC drug where the regulations are telling you what the warning should be, unless it's one of those I'm going to cover in a few minutes. You might not know. So basically, the label of a cosmetic product needs a warning statement whenever it's necessary or appropriate to prevent a health hazard that may be associated with use of the product. If you're including a warning, the statement should be prominent and conspicuous as compared to other statements or designs on your label, in bold type, no less than 1/16 inch letter height, on a contrasting background, and using wording that makes it likely to be read and understood by ordinary individuals under customary conditions of purchase and use. So there's a lot of leeway as to whether you need one or not, but you know, in the days of everybody suing everybody, I would be sure that you evaluate your product to determine that, you know, whether it needs a warning statement or not. Okay, we're going to go over some of the specific ones that are required on cosmetic products, starting with those that are packaged in self-pressurized containers. This would be things like your hairsprays or spray deodorants. These products must contain the warning that you see here in the blue box. And this is the standard wording that you would use, but you can omit the first part about spraying in the eyes if the product is not a spray, such as a shaving foam. Or you could add the phrase, except under adult supervision, if the product was intended for use by children. For products that are packaged in self-pressurized containers, in which the propellant consists in whole or in part of a halocarbon or a hydrocarbon, you would need to use the warning here in the red box. These products are sometimes those that people use to get high with, and that's why you want to be sure you put this warning in. Not that someone who's intending to get high is going to pay any attention to it, but it certainly would alert family members if nothing else. Now, there are some exceptions to this warning. For example, if the products are expelled in the form of a foam or cream, and there is less than 10% propellant in the container, if the product container has a physical barrier that prevents the escape of the propellant at the time of use, if the net quantity of the contents is less than 2 ounces, and the container is designed to release a measured amount with each valve actuation. And of course, for all products with a net quantity of less than ½ an ounce, there's probably not much of a risk of harm, so you don't need the warning statement. There are also additional Environmental Protection Agency labeling requirements if the product is packaged in a self-pressurized container containing a chlorofluorocarbon propellant or other ozone-depleting substance. And those regulations would be found at 40 CFR, Section 82. Now, in the next few slides, you're going to see all of the different warning statements in boxes with different colored backgrounds. I only did that to make the slides more interesting, in my opinion. You don't have to use those colors. In fact, it's probably better to just keep it black. But anyway, I just did it to try to make it fun. Anyway, the FDA defines feminine deodorant spray as any spray deodorant product whose labeling represents or suggests that the product is for use in the female genital area or for use all over the body. The label should contain the warning that you see here in the violet box, although the sentence "spray at least 8 inches from the skin" may be omitted if the expelled contents do not contain a liquefied gas propellant. Be aware also that you can't use terms like hygiene or hygienic for these products or anything similar, as these would be considered implied drug claims in that they're suggesting the product has a medical usefulness. Thus, you have another example here of how your label could be considered misbranded. A foaming detergent bath product is one that's intended to be added to a bath for the purpose of producing foam that contains a surface active agent serving as a detergent or foaming ingredient. In other words, a bubble bath. Labels for these products, except for those labeled exclusively for use by adults, must have both adequate directions for safe use and this caution statement. If the product's intended for use by children, which I guess probably lots of bubble baths are, the phrase "except under adult supervision" may be added at the end of the last sentence. I'm not sure how relevant this particular regulation is. I wasn't able to find any current products on the market, any Coaltar hair dyes. I guess I can understand why, because who would want to sell a cosmetic product and readily admit right on the front panel that it might cause cancer? Not sure that's a very good marketing strategy. Anyways, I also found conflicting information in that the required wording for the warning in the FD&C Act is actually different and more stringent than what is seen here in the regulations, which admittedly were written way back in 1979. If anyone out there has such a product or is considering marketing one, I'll research it for you and find out what the deal is, or I'm sure there are other cosmetic consultants here at EAS that probably have the answer off the top of their head. Most of the sun tanning preparations on the market actually do contain sunscreens, but this regulation applies only to those that don't, such as topical products that are intended to provide cosmetic effects on the skin while tanning through exposure to UV radiation, for example, moisturizing or conditioning products, or those that give the appearance of a tan by imparting color to the skin through application of an approved color additive such as dihydroxyacetone without the need for exposure to UV radiation. There's also a warning that's not actually yet codified in the regulation that the FDA has recommended for inclusion on those products that contain alpha hydroxy acids, such as glycolic acid and lactic acid. The details of how this warning was developed and the risk associated with use of these products is detailed in the guidance document that I've referenced here. And you can find it on FDA's website. The recommended warning that you see is not legally enforceable by the FDA, as most things in guidance documents aren't. However, from a liability standpoint, I always recommend that you include these warning statements just to, as I said before, people like to sue, so better to warn them in advance. It should be used on any cosmetic product that contains an AHA other than as an incidental. If that product is intended for topical application to any skin or mucous membranes that are exposed to the sun, or any that do not otherwise contain a sunscreen ingredient. Now, you probably already know that cosmetics don't require FDA approval or registration. However, the agency does expect that it's been adequately substantiated for safety prior to marketing. The safety of a cosmetic can be substantiated by reviewing available toxicological test data on the ingredients and on similar products, and by performing additional toxicological and other testing that may be appropriate for the product. If the product does not have adequate safety data, it would be misbranded if it did not otherwise include this warning prominently on the principal display panel. All right, well, that's it for the labeling requirements, but bear in mind that most of the regulations that I've covered here actually have much more information, so I'd encourage you to read through them if you are marketing cosmetic products. So let's move on to claims. The FDA doesn't have a list of approved or accepted claims for cosmetics, but it goes without saying that first and foremost, they must be truthful and not misleading. It's particularly important to remember, too, that cosmetic products cannot claim to have any therapeutic effect. That is, they can't be used for purposes such as treating or preventing a disease or affecting the structure or function of the body, including the skin. This would make the product a drug, even if it also affects the person's appearance. Because the FDA does not have the authority to approve claims before cosmetics go on the market, you may see cosmetics with claims that go beyond what the law permits. But bear in mind that both FDA and FTC monitor cosmetics on the market, particularly websites, and they will take action against companies that break the law. And again, you can go on FDA's website and pull up cosmetic warning letters, and you can see what I mean. So how do you know if your claim is a drug claim? Here are some guiding principles. Avoid terms such as treats, prevents, heals, corrects, cures, relieves. Be very careful with any kind of structure function claims. For example, makes scars disappear. Must consider the total label content of any of those soft claims. And of course, don't include the name of any disease or any kind of medical condition. Don't say, anything about acne or rosacea. Like I said, there have been numerous warning letters issued to cosmetic firms that have made unapproved drug claims. And this is the link that you can use if you want to find them out. And most of them are pretty blatant, but there are a few letters that might make you think twice about the claims on your product. And I'm also going to put a plug in here for my EAS colleague, Norma Skolnick. She's actually going to be presenting a webinar in May on cosmetic claims, and she'll be going into more detail and provide additional guidance on what you can and cannot say. In the meantime, this slide provides some examples of what is likely acceptable versus what would more likely than not be considered a drug claim. So you can see, I won't read through it, but you can look at, for example, the mouthwash fights bad breath. That's a cosmetic claim, but you can't really say kills odor-causing germs because then it's going to be an antiseptic of some sort, which would be a drug. There are some other claims that you might want to consider with regard to aromatherapy products. These are typically going to be your essential oils that are very popular these days. Your claims should really just be limited to their fragrance or maybe their softening effect on the skin. Any claims that would consider a therapeutic use, like for easing pain or treating depression, would be considered a drug claim. Some companies, particularly outside the US, like to call products that they consider to have medical benefits cosmeceuticals. This term has no meaning under the law here, and it's not one that's recognized by the FDA, so best to steer clear of it altogether. You often see claims such as cruelty-free or not tested on animals on cosmetics. Again, there's no legal definition of these terms. If you're using this type of claim, be sure that you have documentation that supports it, including substantiation from the suppliers of your ingredients. Hypoallergenic. This term is typically used on products that supposedly produce fewer allergic reactions, but from what I read, the evidence is not conclusive. There are no federal standards that govern this term, although the FDA did make an attempt back in 1975. That regulation was challenged in court and found to be invalid, and as a result, it appears that this claim may continue to be made, whether it has any value to consumers. Really, we don't know, but you can use it if you like. Organic? What a surprise, the FDA has no definition for organic. However, the U.S. Department of Agriculture oversees the National Organic Program, and cosmetics that make an organic claim would be expected to comply with USDA regulations. Before finishing up, there are a couple of other agencies that come into play when discussing labeling, and I mentioned these in the last webinar on the OTC drugs. First of all, your Customs and Border Protection requires country of origin labeling. That's at 19 CFR 134.11, and it states that every article of foreign origin or its container that's imported into the United States should be marked conspicuously to indicate the English name of the country of origin. If you don't make a country of origin declaration, it's assumed that your product is manufactured in the USA. But with so many companies using foreign manufacturers now, it is important to remember this requirement. The Federal Trade Commission oversees made in the USA claims, and they require that the product be all or virtually all made in the USA. So this means that all of your significant parts and processing that go into the product must be of US origin. That is, it really shouldn't contain any or only negligible foreign content. That actually wraps up my talk for today. I'd be happy to answer a few questions if you want to stay online, or you can email me afterwards. And thank you very much for attending.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. We have one question here regarding converting European letter sizes to US. I know EAS sells a type size guide under the resources tab of our website, but is there any conversion table online that people could find?
Actually, that's a really good question. I've never looked for that. I do a lot of the other ones, the volume and weight, but I've never actually done inch. There must be something on there. You must be able to, type in, I would just Google inches to millimeters, and usually that'll pull up a screen that you can just type in the, 1/16 inch, and that'll tell you how many millimeters it is.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Right now, that is our only question. So while we're waiting a couple seconds to see if another comes in, I'll just mention the webinar that Susan referenced, offered by Norma Skolnick, which will be a more in-depth look at cosmetics claims. This will be on May 7th at 1 o'clock Eastern, and you can register for that on the EAS website. And it looks like we have no other questions coming in. So I will say thanks everyone for joining us today. We did record this webinar and it will be available online within a few days. And we, as always, appreciate your interest in EAS and look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Oh, I've got one more question here. Waiting for it to come in. Louise, if you typed, there we go. Okay, I was going to say, if you typed a question, I don't see it. The question is it legal to use a plus or minus or an and/or on a label?
The symbols?
Yes.
In what, like in the ingredients? Or?
Yeah, yes, like a more or less or an and or in the ingredients listing.
Well, you certainly can use and or. I'm not sure more or less. I'm not sure when you would. I'm not sure when you would use more or less. How that would be used in an ingredient declaration.
In the manner of alternative ingredients is what they say.
I believe what I certainly know for drug products, you list your ingredients and then you can say at the end may contain, and you list them out that way. So you could do that, or you could include them just within your ingredient declaration if they may be there. Like if you have two different manufacturers and maybe slightly different formulations for both, you could do that.
And is that also true for a soap blend mixture?
I would, yeah. I mean, it would be. Yeah, I mean, it's as long as if it's a cosmetic, then yes, you just list your. It doesn't really, the regulations I don't believe they go into that much detail. I mean, you just has to list your ingredients. You can, listing and or may contain is I think would be acceptable practice.
Okay, great. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Have a great day.